Hello everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Have you ever wondered why a relatively small island in the eastern Mediterranean ends up dictating so much of Europe's geopolitical border strategy and energy stability? Well, today we're exploring one of the most enduring, complex realities in that entire region, the divided island of Cyprus. This is a conflict that's just steeped in deep historical grievances, ethnic competition, and the heavy involvement of regional powers. But to truly wrap our heads around a conflict like this, we have to deconstruct how the people actually living inside it view their reality. So today we're going totally analytical. We're looking strictly at the historical and political documentary evidence to really break down the Greek Cypriot perspective, their aspirations, their fears, and exactly how they view their neighbors across the divide.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the shift from enosis to federation. Second, the core political aspirations. Third, the dynamic of neighbors versus settlers. Fourth, the true meaning of political equality. And finally, the future of the divide.
Section 1. From enosis to federation. The historical evolution of political goals.
To really grasp what the Greek Cypriot community wants today, we first have to establish their historical baseline. Because, the goals of the present are entirely shaped by the traumas of the past. If we trace their ideological journey, we see a profound shift. Back during the British colonial period and right into the 1950s, the predominant Greek Cypriot political desire was enosis. That meant the union of Cyprus with Greece, driven by a deeply Hellenocentric identity. But of course, this clashed directly with the Turkish Cypriot desire for partition, known as Taksim. In 1960, they managed to reach a compromise with independence and a partnership state. But unfortunately, by 1963, that partnership completely broke down into intercommunal conflict. Then came the defining trauma for the Greek Cypriot psyche, 1974. A Greek-sponsored coup was quickly followed by a Turkish military intervention, leading to the division of the island. Following 1974, the Greek Cypriot strategic objective officially pivoted. They moved away from enosis and a unitary state and shifted toward a bizonal bicommunal federation, often just called a BBF. For the Greek Cypriot leadership, this shift to a federal model isn't seen as a victory. It's viewed as a massive, deeply painful historical compromise made for the sake of peace.
And this number right here explains exactly why that shift happened. 37. That is the percentage of Cypriot territory that has been under Turkish military occupation since the events of 1974. For the Greek Cypriot community, the current situation is absolutely not seen as just some intercommunal dispute. In their eyes, it is fundamentally an issue of illegal foreign invasion and ongoing military occupation. To put that into perspective, this reality resulted in the displacement of roughly 200,000 Greek Cypriots. That displacement deeply shapes their narrative of victimization, their persistent demand for the restoration of justice, and their absolute, unwavering focus on territorial integrity.
Section 2. The core political aspirations. Defining what a viable solution actually looks like.
Keeping that historical trauma in mind, what is their absolute baseline for a functional, sovereign state today? Well, there are a few non-negotiable pillars from the Greek Cypriot perspective. First up, any solution must be based on a single sovereignty, a single citizenship, and a single international personality. They firmly insist that a federation has to evolve from the existing Republic of Cyprus rather than creating some brand new partnership out of two pre-existing sovereign states. Second, they demand the total demilitarization of the island. That means the complete withdrawal of the tens of thousands of Turkish troops currently stationed in the north. Third, they want the abolition of the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee. That treaty gave Turkey, Greece, and the UK the right to intervene, and Greek Cypriots view this as totally anachronistic for a modern European state. And finally, they demand territorial restitution and the right of return for displaced persons to their lawful properties, rather than just settling for financial compensation.
Just listen to how the Republic of Cyprus's Ministry of Foreign Affairs puts it. They envision a free and reunified Cyprus, a common homeland, a model of peaceful coexistence and prosperity for all its citizens. This brilliantly illustrates their desire for a unified, demilitarized state within the European Union. It presents a vision of a shared homeland for Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, Armenians, Maronites, and Latins alike. It's a vision anchored entirely in integration and the rule of law, permanently replacing the rule of force.
Section 3. Neighbors versus Turkish settlers. Perceptions of the other.
So how do Greek Cypriots actually view the people living in the northern part of the island today? If we pivot over to sociology for a second, we find that the Greek Cypriot community holds a very complex, genuinely bifurcated view of the other. The sources show a really sharp distinction made by Greek Cypriots between native Turkish Cypriots and settlers from mainland Turkey. Native Turkish Cypriots are widely viewed with a lot of cultural empathy. They're seen as fellow islanders, cultural cousins with whom they share a long history of coexistence, and ultimately fellow victims of the 1974 divide and Turkey's overarching influence. On the flip side, the perception of mainland Turkish settlers is overwhelmingly negative. They are viewed as a direct demographic threat, essentially brought in by Ankara to artificially alter the island's population makeup, dilute the political voice of the native Turkish Cypriots, and act as a permanent colonizing force. For Greek Cypriots, the repatriation of most of these settlers is a crucial, non-negotiable demand for their own demographic security.
To bring this down to a human level, check out this grassroots perspective from a local community forum. On a sociological level, native Turkish Cypriots are often just seen as historical neighbors who share deeply rooted cultural customs. Think about things like a mutual obsession with halloumi cheese, or hellim as Turkish Cypriots call it, and a deeply shared coffee culture. There is a strong recognition on the ground that despite the massive political chasm and the religious differences, the daily lived experience of just being a Cypriot strongly binds the native populations together.
Section 4. The meaning of political equality. The core deadlock.
Now, despite all that cultural affinity we just talked about, the peace process has been deadlocked for decades. I want you to just pause and consider this question for a moment. How is it possible that two communities can sit across from each other at a negotiating table, use the exact same phrase, political equality, and mean two entirely, completely incompatible things? Well, here is exactly where the clash happens. For Greek Cypriots, political equality is fundamentally a democratic concept. It means equality of citizens, one person, one vote. Because they make up roughly 80% of the native population, they believe a functional state should simply reflect democratic majority rule, paired, of course, with stringent minority rights and protections. Conversely, the Turkish Cypriot definition is based on the equality of communities, totally regardless of population size. They demand an equal political partnership that often requires absolute vetoes and equal representation in governance, leaning really heavily towards sovereign equality between two distinct states. Now, Greek Cypriots fear this definition flat-out violates democratic norms and would inevitably lead to total institutional paralysis. But to objectively understand why this divide persists, we absolutely have to look at the Turkish Cypriot counterperspective. As articulated in our sources, there is a deep-seated fear among Turkish Cypriots that the Greek Cypriot definition of democratic equality is merely a mechanism to drag them right back under majority control. They fear it would reduce them to a mere minority community rather than an equal partner. For the Turkish Cypriot side, true equality requires the recognition of two separate, equal states standing side by side. Anything less is just administration.
Section 5. The future of the divide. Expectations and the European safeguard.
With these fundamentally opposing realities, where do we possibly go from here? Well, according to Interpeace polling data, if you ask Greek Cypriots what they prefer, an overwhelming 92% support a unitary state, a single, fully integrated nation. However, and this is key, 79% still find a federation acceptable. It really underscores that while a unitary state is the absolute dream, a bizonal, bicommunal federation remains a highly acceptable compromise for the Greek Cypriot public, provided, of course, it doesn't include any foreign guarantees or restrictions on their freedoms.
Now let's compare that directly with the Turkish Cypriot polling data. An overwhelming 90% prefer a two-state solution. Yet, a very strong 76% are also prepared to accept a federation as a compromise. But look at this last data point. Only 53% actually support the Greek Cypriot interpretation of a federation. In fact, other polls show they consider that interpretation worse than the current status quo. So while both sides are willing to accept a federation in name, they are literally miles apart on what the actual mechanics of that federation would look like.
So the crucial point we arrive at is how the Greek Cypriot community hopes to somehow bridge this massive gap of trust and security. Their answer? They rely entirely on the European Union. Since the Republic of Cyprus joined the EU back in 2004, the Greek Cypriot strategy expects the EU framework to act as the ultimate guarantor of physical and legal security. For them, the EU isn't just some economic bloc. It is quite literally their preferred substitute for a foreign army, effectively replacing any need for Turkish troops or external guarantors. They envision the application of the EU body of law across the entire island, guaranteeing the four freedoms. That's the free movement of persons, goods, services, and capital. They truly believe Europe is the shield that can protect all Cypriots equally.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. We have a divided island that shares a geography, shares a history, and in so many ways shares a culture. Yet they possess fundamentally opposing geopolitical realities.
Can a shared, reunified future ever actually be built when the two sides cannot even agree on the basic definition of equality? It's a question that will undoubtedly determine the future of the Eastern Mediterranean. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this complex issue through the data and the documents. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll see you in the next Explainer.